they did a horrible job. So I was very concerned with, how we did things and making sure we got it done right. And then, the other part of that is, as a council person, now that we have the report, what do we do? And of course, that's a different process and a different mindset and a different way of thinking. And one of our commission members was very adamant about placing all of the recommendations on the ballot this November. And he just felt that was, this is what we did, this is our work, let's give it to the people and let them do with it what they will. From a council standpoint, I think that was very impractical. We've got the most historic election, in this country's history coming up in November. And we did a lot of work and we put a lot of effort into making the recommendations. So as a body, we could see that if we put 116 or however many proposals on the ballot, most of the public was not going to be able to read those. They weren't going to be able to understand those and give those the thought that they require. So we had to sit down and come up with a number of proposals that we could put on the ballot this year in light of all of the other, the presidential election, of course. And, what could we put on the ballot? Of course, we wanted to pass, but also that we have time to educate people on and to so that it wouldn't get lost in all of the other political maneuvering going on during this election. So I wouldn't venture to say that these are the most important, urgent recommendations, but nevertheless, it was important that we do come out with some things to put on the ballot, and I'll just summarize those issues. The first is dealing with the elections process and the campaign finance process. The second is increasing the size of the police review board. The third issue deals with amending the purchasing and procurement procedures for the city of Cleveland. The fourth issue is civil service, and if I can just piggyback on what Matt said, we spent hours looking at the civil service process and regulations, and it's certainly something I think that we will be looking at in the future. It's a very important issue. A lot of very passionate people involved, and a number of great proposals were brought to the commission, and I think it's a topic that really requires study and analysis on its own. So, and I think as a council we will be doing that. The next issue would be the size of city council, and I think that's the one probably most people are familiar with and are very interested in. And the last issue deals with the referendum time period for passing ordinances, city council ordinances. So basically, this is what we're putting on the ballot for November of 2008. The other recommendations, again, they were all excellent recommendations, and I think what we'll be doing, I'm the chair of the legislation committee of City Council, so I have an agenda now for the committee, and we will be looking at how we deal with the other issues that were made in the report made by the Charter Review Commission, how we deal with those. Some of those again require more in-depth study and analysis than we were able to give during the process. But we'll be definitely looking at those and putting more issues on the ballot on the ballot in upcoming elections.
Okay, thanks. Next, let's turn to Bill Callahan, who's going to talk about some of the recommendations that were put in place so that this is not just a 6-month discussion, so that this continues past November's election.
Yeah, one of the things that I think it's important for people to understand is that there are going to be 6 ballot questions, but they incorporate over 20 of the Commission's recommendations. It's not accurate to say that it's 6 out of 116. Several of them are kind of joint compoundings of 4 or 5 different recommendations that were made. If you look at the specific proposals, for example, look at civil service, and there's a group of proposals that are there. But nonetheless, it is the case, as Councilwoman Cleveland just said, that we ended up, after 6 months of looking section by section through the charter, with 116 different changes that had a pretty clear consensus I mean, it wasn't necessarily unanimous, but, you know, it was at least a majority, and in most cases significantly more than a majority agreement, that it would be better for city government if this were changed. Now, this is, you know, the degree of urgency that different people feel might have varied, but there was at least a consensus that it made sense for city council and the people of the city to look at this change. 116 mostly substantive changes is a pretty big agenda. And the way that, having been on the previous commission, I can tell you that we had about 80 that commission produced, of which I think 7 ever made it to the ballot. And what that says to me, and I think there was some agreement on the commission, is that it may be that the way that this was originally constructed needs to be reconstructed. We have a governing document for the city. In order to change that governing document, there has to be a majority vote of the people. And the truth is, the world changes. And it actually changes pretty fast in terms of city organization. There are a lot of very real issues that are simply because the world has changed in 20 years. So we actually recommended 3 changes. They're the last 3 recommendations. And none of them are on the ballot this year. But they're the last 3 recommendations that we made. We recommended, first of all, that the charter process should happen every 10 years, not every 20. Please do not roll your eyes and groan. Believe me, I want to, right? Having been through it at either ends of a 20-year period. But the thought was, frankly, that this is, well, let me say the other 2. We think it should go for a year. And we think that the requirement that the council then act within 30 days to choose some proposals and put them on the ballot really is kind of beside the point. Okay? What really needs to happen is a thorough review, some recommendations, and then an ongoing structured deliberative process that may take much longer than 30 days, right, for council to get stuff on the ballot that needs to be looked at and modernized. I don't think any of us would say that these 3 things represent the perfect change, but we were trying to raise the issues, which is, if you're going to sit, you know, for 5 weeks and listen to 2 to 3 hour presentations about one element of the charter, civil service, and you go into that process for the most part knowing almost nothing about the subject, and you come in at the other end of the process knowing what a couple of parties think about that process, are you in a position to make recommendations to the city about reform of the civil service provisions of the charter? I didn't feel like I was, right? I felt like I knew a lot more at the end of the process than I did at the beginning, but one of the things I knew is that there were some issues that needed further investigation. And, you know, quite serious, and, you know, the equity issues were clearly, you know, debatable. I mean, there were points of view that needed to be considered. That was a particular instance. It took so much time and was so complex that it's the perfect illustration of that. But the bottom line is that there are both constituency interests to consider and also just plain old details to consider about each of these things. And you're trying to figure out what to do that makes sense for the operation of the city. Frankly, there was not a lot of conflict within the commission about value propositions. I mean, really, very little. Really, the debates were really about, would that work? And I think that even on the most controversial public subject, which is the size of council, a lot of the discussion was simply, how workable is that? What effect does that produce, right? So I guess the bottom line of all this is to say, as somebody who is, you know, both as a younger person and as in my current condition, having been part of this process, in a process that spans 4 city administrations, right? I mean, this goes back to the Wojnowicz administration, right? It seems pretty clear that the details of designing city government so that all the players in it, there are a whole lot of people working over at City Hall in different functions, right? That the different components of it actually work, interact well, you know, that the rules work. Figuring that out from the point of view of 15 citizens, right, is a daunting and complex process.